Hello, I'm Dr. Catherine Hayward. Welcome to Please Continue, I'm Listening, today with Jonathan Emmons. I met Jonathan a few months ago and have been fascinated to bring him to a podcast. He's a scientist, and he has a way of explaining viruses and vaccines and immunity that I find very appealing, and I want to make sure that you get to hear about it. I'm going to give you a little clue. It involves an analogy with a car. Jonathan, I'm learning, is a person who, when he was growing up, was a kid that maybe was a bit of a challenge to parents because he liked to take stuff apart and he liked to know why things worked the way that they did. And that's probably part of the reason that I like sitting with him, because I was a similar kind of kid. So, Jonathan, let's start with the car. We have been dealing since 2019, 2020, with a virus called coronavirus that created worldwide disaster. And when it first came into the human population, it made people so sick that we lost millions of people. Millions of people died. And not very many months after this pandemic began, some vaccines showed up. And that caused a lot of people like me to celebrate, and it caused a lot of other people to be very suspicious. And I've tried over these years a lot of different ways to help people understand what was going on with these vaccines and how were they helping people who got infected with the virus. And I've never heard the analogy of the car until I met you. So please tell us the story.
Of course. So with my background, it's always easier to explain things in analogies because a lot of people don't understand the terminology that's very particular to the synthetic biology or the molecular biology field. So I came up with this analogy that, like Catherine said, really helps kind of understand the way that vaccines, mRNA vaccines, how they work within the body and um, kind of their components. So mRNA vaccines in themselves, the ones that are commercially supplied, they consist of two main components. One being a lipid nanoparticle, which I consider the car. Cars are made of all different types of components that give them function. The wheels, the engine, the chassis, the windows, everything has a part to play in how that car gets from point A to point B. Um, as well as, something that's kept inside of that car or that lipid nanoparticle, or the mRNA vaccine. And what that mRNA is just single-stranded genetic information that encodes for proteins. And so the way I really love to kind of show this method is to explain that cars in and of themselves are able to go from point A to point B. Um, and let's imagine there's someone in the car driving it, and they are driving to your house, and they have an envelope, they have some type of instructions, let's say sheet music.
Hmm.
Um, they leave this sheet music, they slide it through your mail slot in the front door. And you're surprised because you weren't expecting mail today. But you open up that mail, um, you look at the sheet music, and you've never seen the sheet music before, and you start playing it. And you listen to the song that's playing, and you get familiar with it. You decode that instructions that that person brought to your door and laid in you know, your mail slot. Well, along with that sheet music, there's also a note saying, "Hey, this song shouldn't be played. Or this song should not belong in the house, but you've learned it. So you know, hey, if I ever hear this song again, I shouldn't allow it in the house." And so let's imagine that outside of your house you have a guard dog or security cameras or a bouncer who's listening to you play the music inside. And they understand that if they hear music coming from the inside of the house, that music signifies danger. So days, weeks, months go by. You've played this song that first day. You learned this song the first couple days you had it, and you haven't touched that sheet music in months. But your bouncers, your guard dogs, your security cameras, they're on high alert. They've heard that song. They know the song. And if they ever hear that song, they know it's danger. So let's say someone gets infected with a virus that sheet music like signifies, like the coronavirus. And they're driving, that coronavirus is driving a different car. A car, you know, that may not be recognizable. It's different from that first car, but it's driving down your street and it parks outside your front door and it starts playing that exact same song that you heard months ago. Well, your bouncers and your guard dog and your security cameras are going to pick up on that pretty quickly. And they're going to, go over there and deal with this danger that showed up at your front door. And that's kind of how I like to explain this whole immunity system. It's especially with mRNA vaccines is we're delivering something that has instructions that you learn and you understand within your body to be danger, so that later on when you hear someone playing that same music, let's say for instance the Jaws theme song, you know that's a shark coming down your driveway, or that's something that poses a risk to your health. So yeah.
That song strikes fear in my heart.
Same here. And I think it's particularly important to talk about this as a car analog because every year they come out with new makes and new models of cars, and every year there's new hit music or new musics that you need to listen to, and this is kind of like this booster situation, whereas the music that viruses play changes over the course of the entire virus's lifespan, how long it's within the population as a whole. But if you have the sheet music delivered to your door, you can listen for that. Your helpers outside, your immune system, can listen for that song so that if some new make and model of a different virus's car comes by and starts playing music, you can quickly recognize that and get them off your property before they start causing detrimental effects. So
you're talking about mutations or variants that we've all read about, and you're talking about getting updated vaccines periodically because scientists like you are keeping track of what's going on with these viruses and how they are mutating.
Yeah, so every so often the CDC will sequence new influenzas, new COVIDs. They'll send out these sequences that they've found in other parts of the world. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Omicron variant, Delta, all these different nomenclatures, but that's cases worldwide that they've found, they've sequenced, and they've realized that this is a variant. This is mutated from the original parent genome. And so they send that out. Everyone, prints out new sheet music to deviate to the masses. So it's kind of this, you need to stay up to date with the newest music because if you hear something new and it's a little bit different tempo or a little bit different in a different key, you may not necessarily pick up on that song, or it might be sung by a different artist. So the quicker that you can listen in and you can actually understand that, hey, this is that song that I heard, the typically the less severe symptoms you will experience. Um,
It, it's such a wonderful and special way to describe something that I think has been very mystifying for a lot of people. And one of the things that you mentioned to me before we started the podcast was people have heard of the Spanish flu pandemic that happened in the early part of the 20th century that killed millions of people. I think the statistics are 1 in 3 people was affected by it. And the influenza, what you told me was the influenza that we are experiencing now in the 2020s um, are variants of that thing from 100 years ago.
yeah, so typically the way that viruses work is when they're initially transmitted from most of the time animals to humans. So the statistic they like to say around 70% of known viruses are actually zoonotic diseases. So what that means is they are transmitted from an invertebrate that's not a human into a human. So typically fruit bats, um, swine, bovine, and avian are kind of the typical vectors for these viruses to mutate and then learn how to infect humans. And once that happens, then you have um, these situations like the Spanish influenza of 1918. There's the Asian flu of 1957, the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968. All of these different outbreaks where they originated typically from avian origin and then spread. And over time, viruses will evolve to be more contagious but less lethal, just based on the fact that they want to infect as much as possible. But if if the host dies before they can infect more, it's not a positive effect for the longevity of viruses. So typically, um, most flu variants nowadays can be traced back to some of these original flu epidemics where they first swapped over from avian, from from pigs, from bats into humans. So it's one of those things where once it's in the population, once it knows how to infect humans, it's around, for good until we have some massive program to eradicate it, like we did with smallpox and polio back in the day. So,
So this zoonotic theme that you're bringing up, I think is really important, especially for us in Living Whole Online, because people who are interested in this program understand that some of the things that are happening on the planet right now, including climate change and including the the way that the animal kingdom is being compressed and moved by the human kingdom, is creating this crossover between viruses that have just lived in animals for millennia, and now they're jumping
mhm,
species and they're jumping to us. And an example in the case of coronavirus causing lethal effects until vaccines came
mhm.
along. Jonathan, as a scientist, what is your sense of what's going to happen over the course of the next several decades with regard to this kind of transmission from the animal kingdom
Mhm.
to the human kingdom?
Well, I'm kind of a big history guy, so I like to look at the historical aspects of viruses and things like that. And when you look at the recorded incidences of pandemics or situations where viruses have transferred from other animals into humans, um, you see a kind of an interesting trend. It's very much increasing, and like you said, there's lots of different reasons that synergistically boil into this whole phenomenon. like urbanization, um, you know, increasing supply, increasing demand on protein sources from animals. Um, as a society, we are much more integrated together globally than we were 100 years ago. I think one of the main reasons why we had the Spanish influenza as bad as it was is because we had a pretty major event happening back in that day that greatly influenced travel between Europe and the Americas and Asia and all these different places.
That being the war.
That being the First World War. And so nowadays we have exponentially more travel. We have ecotourism. We have people, traveling across the entire globe in a matter of hours, um, and that only leads to increased availability of vectors for these viruses to transfer. But overall, I don't see this trend decreasing until there's some sort of factor that goes against what the trend is now. So it's unfortunately something that we need to prepare for, and that's especially why I think mRNA vaccines are such a cool thing. Like I said, they're just a vehicle that contains information that gives you the ability to fight an infection that you may later have. And the like I said, the cool thing about that is you can give your vaccine all these different informations that encode for all these other viruses that potentially might come into effect. I know right now there's a big H5 influenza strain that's um, in bovine in dairy cows, and so the fact that we have that sequences already over 2 years ago, we've already put in place methods and procedures to kind of combat that. I think of any of the major makers of vaccines have started this H5 influenza vaccine, so that if this ever does become a human to human transmission type of virus, that we've already been primed, we already have this information ready, we've already tested it, we know it to be safe. Boom.
And the safety, I'm glad you brought that up because the safety has been something that I've heard a lot of people be very concerned about and even suspicious about. It seemed to people that as soon as COVID hit and we had this horrible pandemic, within just a really quick period of time, all of a sudden these mRNA, these messenger RNA vaccines came through.
Mm-hmm.
But what you tell me
Yeah,
is
the
that
history of it. Yeah,
it's been going on for a while.
yeah. So the concept of an mRNA vaccine is actually quite old. It was first kind of pinnacled in the 1990s, early 1990s, and many different researchers delved into it during the 1990s, um, and kind of laid the foundation for what we know nowadays. But the main concern at that in that early stage was how can we deliver this in a healthy way? Because we knew how mRNA worked, we knew what it took to get that into a cell, what it does, what it needs to code for, but that vehicle, that car that was to take that information to the body, it wasn't the best. And so they had to change the way they formulated that. They first had to figure out a way to formulate it at a mass scale, which wasn't until the early 2000s. And then this idea of an cationic ionizable lipid kind of solved the whole issue with this toxicity that was first associated in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so there were many different mRNA vaccines that were created late 2000s, early 2010s, um, by some companies that were for very specific rare diseases. So the technology was where it needed to be. The understanding of how mRNA works, what we need to modify it, how it works within the body, how can we keep it stable? I mean, I think everyone can remember the fact of having to thaw out your vaccines before you take it, and that's because RNA in itself is very unstable. So we had to fix that problem. And it just, everything kind of came together in the right time for some companies to quickly churn out something that actually was efficient at lowering cases of COVID. So,
which saved untold numbers of lives.
mhm.
How did you, as a young man getting yourself educated, how did you get here?
It's a good question. um, so as a child, um, I think, like you said, I like to question things. I like to take things apart. I really liked to just understand the things around me. Um, I'm sure that was a little bit difficult for my parents, asking why every time they told me to do something. But I think it really gave me a good um, basis for how I kind of wanted to move throughout life. So I obviously wanted to be some sort of engineering, some sort of problem solver, and so naturally gravitated towards the STEM field. Um,
And what is STEM?
STEM is just science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's just a science-based area of focus. But within that realm, I really like the engineering and I really like the biology side of things. I remember one of the coolest things I did when I was younger, especially in high school. We had this lab where we took bacteria cells, we took DNA that encoded for fluorescent proteins, we somehow got that into the bacteria and then grew the bacteria up, and under a black light they were fluorescing. So I thought that was the coolest thing ever. You could put something in a bacteria and make them do something. It's like little nano machines. And it's interesting that that's kind of exactly what I do nowadays. I took that knowledge, that love of biology, the love of solving problems, figuring out things, um, and yeah, I work in primarily in synthetic biology, molecular biology field within the mRNA vaccine realm. So yeah.
Well, it gives me so much hope when I meet somebody your age with your education, your passion, and your intelligence, and your commitment to trying to solve some of the problems that we face in our needy world right now. So I want to thank you so much for doing this podcast with me.
Of course.
And I know that we will be doing more things together in Living Whole Online, but this is a really wonderful way to start off our relationship and the relationship that you, Jonathan, can have with people who are participants in our program.
Hmm.
So thank you so much.
You're welcome.